Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. So, I'm Rayyan Zafar. I'm a psychedelic neuroscientist working at Imperial College's Center for Psychedelic Research. I'm joined today on my right hand side by colleagues from Imperial, neuroscientists, and on the left from UCL. Today's talk is going to really dive into, I'd say, the last 10 years of research, which saw a resurrection of psychedelics in mainstream medicine, in clinical research, brain research. We're going to go through kind of chronologically some of the earlier findings, what we know, what we think we know, and what we want to find out in the future. But I think I want to kick off by saying that psychedelic research is one of the most booming areas of medical research at the moment. In fact, we have more psychedelic research now than we ever have. Many of you may know that this was catalyzed in the 50s and 60s with a lot of research with LSD and some small amounts of research with psilocybin. It was called indocybin at the time. And this was banned in 1971. And it was banned because people were using it and there was a lot of political stigma, moral fear surrounding the substance. And that essentially quelled all psychedelic research for around 50 years. It was astonishing. It's actually one of the largest censorships in scientific research that we think has ever happened. And it's probably led to innumerable amounts of suffering because what we know now about psychedelics is they do hold true potential. And I say the word potential and promise because we have to be careful as scientists to make sure that when we talk about psychedelics, we do it in a way which reflects the current evidence. And that's sort of what we'll be exploring today. So I'm going to kick off by asking each of the panelists to quickly introduce themselves, and then we'll jump straight in. And if you do have any questions, as I mentioned, we've got 30 minutes at the end. So I'll start with the UCL corner. So Bex, can you introduce yourself for me?
Hi guys, my name is Bex Harding. I'm a PhD student at UCL. Greg and I are working on the Unity project where we're administering the drug DMT both in healthy and subclinical populations. We're using neuroimaging to explore the effects and how it works in the brain. Greg?
Yeah, this one. Hi. Hello, I'm Greg Cooper, also at UCL. As Beck said, I'm in my final year of my PhD now, and I've been working on this DMT project for the last 4 years. Started a little bit before my PhD on that, and we've only just started dosing our participants. So the study's called the Unity project, Unity standing for Understanding Neuroplasticity Induced by Tryptamines. So tryptamines, I've never said tryptamines before in my life. Well, that was quite a short introduction. Should we leave it at that?
Yeah, we'll dive into that a little bit later. Maria?
Hi everyone, nice to see you here today. My name is Maria Balaet, and hi Sana, that's my daughter. And I'm a computational neuroscientist at Imperial College in London, where I've been for the past 7 years. But importantly for this panel in particular, for the past 4 years I've been working on what I believe to be one of the largest study arms in the UK, looking at recreational drug use, following around 130,000 individuals for the past 4 years, trying to understand how doing drugs outside of the laboratory influences their cognitive ability and mental health. And Chris?
Hi everyone, my name is Chris Timmerman. I'm a postdoc researcher. I work at also the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, where I lead the DMT research group, where we do studies with DMT in neuroimaging environments and 5-MeO DMT. And the main, I guess, quest that we have in that group is to understand how psychedelics can shed light on questions of the relationship between the brain and the mind, the nature of consciousness, and stuff like that.
Thank you, and we're definitely going to get into that. So actually, on that point, I'd like to sort of kick off the conversation with some of the earliest, in fact, the first fMRI, so that's one way of imaging the brain. One of the first studies that was done in 2012 by Imperial, by Professor Robin Carr-Harris and Professor David Nutt. And the experiment was in healthy individuals, and it was to look at the effects, the neurobiological effects, of LSD and psilocybin in the brain. So if anyone wants to kick off and kind of walk through the experiment, why we did it, and what the kind of findings. Maybe Chris, you can start that because you were with the group at the time.
Yeah, well, actually, I wasn't with the group for the psilocybin and LSD, but I can explain them. Yeah, I arrived just after that. They did those experiments, and essentially, I think the Robin Carhart Harris, which was my mentor, along with David Nutt, they both really kickstarted what I would consider to be modern neuroimaging, certainly in the UK, very prominent study, and they had the question of trying to understand what happens to the brain under magic mushrooms. That was really the most essential question. So they injected psilocybin, which is the active chemical component of magic mushrooms, while people were lying inside of the fMRI scanner. And they were actually expecting the brain to light up in all bunch of different ways, right? If you think about a psychedelic experience, it's a very rich experience that is full of content. Instead, what they found was that some key centers of brain activity were shutting down, and there was a disconnection, disintegration of a very specific network, which is called the default mode networks, are kind of like the network that is most prominently active in our normal waking conscious state. So that was a very, I think, intriguing study because it shed light on this notion of ego dissolution, ego death under psychedelics, right? And this default mode network has been strongly linked to this idea of a narrative self, our sense of identity that has to do with, semantic language information, everything that we can say about ourselves, right? Our identities and so on. So the study those results led to this initial sort of idea that, psychedelics shut down the default mode network, which is the seat of the self in the brain. Now we know that was a bit of an oversimplification in terms of, what we can say about those findings, but I think it still remains as a very valid milestone in psychedelic research and, the implications that I'm sure you'll talk about now.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things that maybe we want to get across, like now in this era, if any of you follow psychedelic research, you'll hear a lot about this so-called default mode network. And there's a lot of, I'd say, oversimplification of actually what these brain networks really mean in a tangible sense related to behavior. And so I was wondering maybe if any of the UCL team could maybe break down what it is that we say the default mode network is, what people kind of misinterpret it to be. Often journalists, unfortunately, really have issues with kind of oversimplifying it. And we talk about this self-referential network, but really, what does it really do, the default mode network?
Yeah, so I guess there is some nuance to this one. The default mode network is... so who knows what I mean by a network here? Do people know what I mean by a network? Just in case. So by a network, we mean a group of separate brain regions. So they're not touching each other. That seem to share activity. So the activity of these regions correlates with each other. And the default mode network was this discovery that was made back in early 2000s, where you put someone in an fMRI scanner and then look at which regions are correlating with each other. And if you have someone doing nothing in a scanner, so resting, you see the default mode network lighting up. So this is really a correlate of what we're doing or what our brain's doing when we're doing nothing at all. And I think the problem of applying this as like a main explanatory narrative behind how psychedelics work in the brain is that taking a drug is a task. The default mode network, when you give someone any task in the scanner, goes away. You see other networks lighting up that are related to language processing or numerical processing. But when you give someone a psychedelic drug, they're now doing visual processing. They're now doing all sorts of memory types of processing. So you wouldn't expect, if you gave someone that as just a task on a computer screen, you wouldn't expect those regions to light up. And we also see with a handful of other drugs, so cannabis and MDMA and benzodiazepines and I'm getting nervous now. Wow, I'm on my soapbox here. We also see the default mode network go away in those circumstances. So I think it's really early days for psychedelic research is what I want to say. I don't want to be too quick to jump to the conclusion that this is what's conferring both the most interesting things about the experience and also the main correlates of getting better afterwards.
But just harking to the, as much as we don't really know what the default mode network is per se, there is also evidence from other fields of research, not just in psychedelic research, of what the default mode network is. And in cases of depression, there is overactivity in the default mode network, which is linked to rumination and sort of ruminating on sort of how bad your life is and that sort of thing. And in this early clinical trial with psilocybin at Imperial, it was seen with psilocybin that there was reductions in the default mode network, which indicated that it might be good for treating depression where there's an overactivity. And that sort of led to the earlier, the more recent clinical trials. And it really did launch this sort of renaissance with psychedelics in a more clinical context. So I think as much as the default mode network is debatable, that insight did also launch a lot more research into the clinical uses.
Yeah, and I think in sort of defense of the default mode, so known sort of treatments such as antidepressants, sleep deprivation, electroconvulsive therapy, even the placebo effect are known to decrease activity in the default mode network, which leads to the antidepressant effect. So we know that at least this network is important in psychiatry, but it's not just depression. Like, we know the default mode network is involved in other psychiatric disorders, in addiction, in OCD, in eating disorders, and things that we are now beginning to characterize as internalizing psychiatric disorders that are kind of rooted in this ruminative thinking, these negative thought biases, which are characteristic of many mental health problems and psychiatric disorders. And that's possibly one of the reasons why psilocybin therapy, psychedelic therapy, has what we call transdiagnostic efficacy. So it works across these indications. But sort of going to the clinical effects, I think maybe Chris or Maria, could you maybe describe some of the clinical research that kind of followed some of the earlier brain imaging with psilocybin, sort of the main findings with the depression trial? If any of you two want to kick off with that.
I guess I can speak a bit about that. What followed afterwards, at least for Imperial Colleges, was also a study run by Robin Carhart-Harris and his team at the time before he moved over to San Francisco. Was a clinical trial trying to see whether psychedelics do indeed lessen symptoms of depression in people who have been depressed and treatment resistant for a very long time. So they've tried a variety of different avenues in order to treat their condition, and none of them have been successful. And what they did at that time, this was run, I think, around the year 2020, so quite recently, and it's been published 2 years ago, was to try to compare the effects of psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms, with those of escitalopram. And for people who might not be familiar with escitalopram, this is an SSRI, a serotonergic reuptake inhibitor, and it's actually one of the first lines of treatments that's being given from the NHS when people present themselves to their general practitioners with symptoms of depression, when therapy might not be available straight away, which is quite often. And what my colleagues have noticed with this study at that time was that indeed both psilocybin and the SSRI escitalopram did manage to decrease the symptoms of depression in those participants. But what was very interesting was not only that they had similar magnitudes of decrease in their depressive symptoms, but with psilocybin it only necessitated, they did receive 2 administrations, but after the first one the effect was already very pronounced. Whereas with SSRIs, it's something that you have to take on a daily basis, and the side effects of that are often very unpleasant, and they also take quite a long time until they begin to work properly and people start tolerating them better. So it did suggest that psilocybin might be something that's very potentially important in treating depression, and maybe we'll see it coming to the NHS, I don't know.
Yeah, well, we can jump into that translation of these results, because that's really what's going to be defining sort of the next part of this decade. So on top of the research that we did, there was the largest trial published by a company called Compass Pathways, which sort of validated the work that Robin did, which showed this enduring effect of psilocybin therapy. So a single dose, 25 milligrams, which we think is around 4 or 5 grams of dried mushroom, so a proper trip. In treatment-resistant depression, it found that 25% of people 3 months after went into remission. And that might not seem like a lot, and I think it's important to state that this isn't a panacea. But treatment-resistant depression, by definition, means that those people aren't responding to any treatment. And actually, there's 100 million people in the world with that condition. So even if 25 million of them are being recovered, you can imagine the benefit that brings globally, socioeconomically, to public health systems. It really is making a difference. And now, outside of that very high end of treatment-resistant depression, there's research being done in major depressive disorder, which is not as clinically severe, but we're starting to see, similar effects in terms of rapid onset of clinical therapeutic effects and this enduring effect. Some patients seem to have, after just one trip with a therapist, remission up to 6 months, but others don't. And I don't know whether we could maybe Chris, you could maybe go into maybe some of the new research as to how we're trying to look at responders versus non-responders, whether we can even try and find brain correlates to that, or even maybe you could talk about, is there a brain correlate to the clinical effects of psilocybin therapy in depression? Have we found any neurophysiological effects?
Oh, yeah. Well, a couple of things I think that come to mind. One is the difference of the people that respond versus that they don't respond with psilocybin. I think one of the things that has come up is that, at least partially, and this doesn't apply to everyone, but the people who were previously on an antidepressant medication before having the psychedelic treatment, it seemed that they didn't respond as well as those who had never taken an antidepressant. So there seems to be something about somehow the psychedelic competing with that previous treatment, or that previous treatment in a way blunting the possibilities of how the psychedelic might act in the brain. And this is kind of like an intuition that has been around in psychiatry for a while, that if you're on SSRIs or antidepressant medication, the psychedelic drug, medicine, whatever you want to call it, kind of competes with those same receptors. And so that effect might be a bit blunted. That's one possibility. Or the other possibility is that that history of taking the antidepressant medication somehow generates a stronger resistance for the system to have that experience. This is not to knock down antidepressant medication. Antidepressant medication can work for a lot of people, certainly stabilize mood in many cases that need that stabilization. But yeah, I mean, I think it's reasonable to suggest that a completely new drug treatment will help in that regard. And when it comes to what's happening to the brain after this therapy, I think one of the most prominent early findings of this that still has to be replicated is around how after the psychedelic treatment, and especially those who really get better after the psychedelic treatment, we found that the brain becomes more fluid, more integrated, less modular. So the idea of modularity in the brain is the one that, as we go about life and we engage with the environment and our lives and so on, our brains kind of compartmentalize. They develop modules according to the different needs that the environment and our lives present to us. This is what you would call a modular brain. So you would have a modular, area or systems that relate to when we think about ourselves, like the default mode network system, or another modular area related to how we engage with tasks, complicated decision making, and so on. These modules kind of break down, it seems, or they become more fluid after the psychedelic treatment. And it seems like it's this strong rigidity or crystallization that happens in depression that seems to be particularly effective to break down with the psychedelic treatment.
Can I just make a quick comment on the COMPASS trial that you mentioned before? So you mentioned that the largest trial with psilocybin that's been done to date in a treatment-resistant depression population, they actually used 3 control groups. So one was 1 milligram of psilocybin, which was used as an active placebo. So placebo is what we use in science to sort of make a comparison. So they used 1 milligram of psilocybin, 10 milligrams of psilocybin, and 25 milligrams of psilocybin. And they found that the 1 milligram and 10 milligram of psilocybin had no clinical efficacy, and you need 25 milligram of psilocybin. So 10 milligram of psilocybin, which is about a gram or so of mushrooms, debatable depending on the strain and the strength, whatever, that is not enough to mediate this clinical effect that we're seeing in the lab. You need a bigger, larger dose to see this clinical benefit. Just thought I'd point that out.
So I just wanted to jump in, but before we move on, I think this question that you asked originally about why some people respond and why some people don't really gets right to the heart of what I find so interesting about psychedelics, which is these overlapping what we call mechanisms of action. So that's basically like how these drugs work, how they change people. And so on the one level we can see, so Chris mentioned that people that have taken SSRIs before might see this kind of diminished effect or like this lower chance of responding to a psychedelic treatment if they're already depressed. Well, this suggests that there's stuff, because these are two drugs interacting, that there's stuff happening on the cellular level. And there is, we see these effects in terms of psychedelics reducing inflammation in cell cultures, so just cells in a petri dish. And we also see these effects of psychedelics, well, everyone's heard of neuroplasticity, right? So on the cellular level, that means creating new connections between neurons. But neuroplasticity kind of extends beyond that as well. It can also be plasticity in cognitive systems and behavior, and also just larger scale changes in how different brain regions are communicating with each other. You can call that plasticity too. And then I think the really interesting part is that also we know that the experience itself, like any experience, it doesn't have to be a psychedelic experience, can change us. And somehow there's this interaction between an experience that we have and then these effects on a cellular level as well. So when we're asking the question of why some people respond and some people don't, there are so many different levels of interaction that we have to look in. And that's what I find so exciting and beautiful, but also very messy and hard to study about all of this.
May I also jump in to add on the top of that, basically, and what my colleagues have said so far? An individual is having a psychedelic experience. Often individuals have such high variability between them in terms of their personality, their life history, certain traumatic events that they had, certain associations that they created about the meaning of what might come up during that experience. And I think it's not all in the drug, it's not all the molecule, it's also how the individual interacts with what happens during that trip, basically. What they work through. That's why we see such differences sometimes between what certain experience in one environment might lead to and what something in a therapeutic context might lead to, which is really what we've all been talking about here. Those are very different to what happens when someone just randomly takes the drug. It's not all the drug, it's how the individual and their personality interacts with that as well.
Yeah, that brings us on sort of to really fascinating bit about what is it about psychedelics in and of themselves. So you're saying a bit about neurobiology, but like the experience, and what is it about the experience and what do we know about the experience which we think is related to clinical outcome? And so what we do in our research is we do these questionnaires where we ask individuals to sort of rate their trip on different scales, such as emotional breakthrough, or we have this scale called the mystical experience questionnaire, which sounds a little bit woo, but we're trying to like capture the acute experience and see how that relates to changes in depression. And most, but not all studies find that there is this correlation between the mystical experience induced by the psychedelic state and the clinical outcome. But maybe that brings us on to like the question of, is the trip necessary? And that is something which has been kind of developed in the last few years. So there's this new body of research going on which looks trying to target the same receptor in the brain, the serotonin 2A receptor, where classic psychedelics such as LSD, DMT, and psilocybin bind to, but try to induce a state which develops potentially neuroplasticity, but without the trip, and see whether that could actually lead to an antidepressant effect. So I just want to open up to the panel, and if you could give some thoughts on the development of these non-psychedelic analogues, and whether you think there's promise for them, what are the advantages or maybe relative disadvantages of that, versus the actual psychedelic experience.
May I just quickly give a bit of thought on that? Just like no individual is the same, no type of depression is the same as well. And I think there's really good that we're trying all of these different avenues to try to find compounds that maybe might not be might be useful in treating depression in people who, for example, might not be able to sustain going through a trip. Like if someone has additional neurological or psychiatric conditions that really prevent them from potentially being able to have a pleasant or positive experience with a psychedelic, that would be a very, very good thing to try. But so far, they're yet to be trialed in humans and to see what is actually happening in an individual. We have some very promising data from laboratory animal studies, but it's yet to see anything afterwards. And I think, that's the next stage. We're potentially moving to trying to compare when is the trip necessary rather than if the trip is necessary at all.
So I think it's very interesting, this whole discussion of whether the trip is necessary and what's happening. And to me, it just responds to a culture in which we've dissociated so much the idea of the brain or nature and the mind and consciousness. And it's really like, the heritage of Descartes that, kick-started this whole division in thinking about these things. It's intriguing because, if you ask someone who takes SSRIs, they are having an experience of the SSRIs. They're not tripping necessarily, but they are having a change in mood that then when they go out into the world, the environment responds differently to that, and then they respond differently to that. And you could argue that SSRIs, the effect of SSRIs are very much mediated also by the experience that they evoke. And there's research also showing this, even with clinical models of animals and rats in which they give SSRIs. So I find it that it's I don't know, it's really kind of a push of the biomedical status quo of understanding mental health as this isolated thing that happens within the individual and within the brain that is just pushing its agenda back into, what many people intuitively know about the psychedelic experience. So if you talk about people who have life-changing experiences with psychedelics, that they got better out of depression, they will just automatically tell you because it was very meaningful, because I was able to revise these things that were very important to me, because I had a cathartic experience, because I felt connected with the environment. And so all this is very intuitive for these individuals. And at the other level, which I really find this is why it's so interesting, the way psychedelic research, pushes these matters to the forefront of psychiatric research, clinical research, mental health research, well-being, and so on, is also the relevance of context. And we know very well that the outcome of a psychedelic experience is very much related to how that experience is held, contained, directed, guided, and so on and so forth. Really putting a strong stress that there's a relational quality in that psychedelic experience that in the context of psychiatry or psychology or therapy happens between a therapist and a patient. That quality of that experience, what we call the therapeutic alliance, also predict these changes. So I find it really hopeful that this kind of research is happening. My bet would be that, clearly the intriguing quality of the psychedelic experience will have a massive effect over the one of just a neuroplasticity effect with a less interesting experience, and then maybe push, the research on mental health and neuroscience to something that conceives of the mind and the quality of the mind, i.e. mental health and well-being, as something that not just resides in the brain, but is the brain and the body, the brain, the body and others, the brain, the body and the wider world, and of course at the center of that, experience, which is such a primary thing in our everyday lives.
Can I just, sorry.
I was going to say that brings us quite nicely.
I was going to make a comment about neuroplasticity. I feel like it's a term that people in this context will think of favorably, But neuroplasticity isn't always a good thing, and it's not necessarily just for mental health. You know, neuroplasticity is a process in which you learn new things, like when you're learning a language or an instrument. But it's also how mental health disorders actually can develop. Like if you take cocaine and you become addicted to it, it's because there's been neuroplasticity. It's because there's been a growth of connections which has created this addiction, for example. So I think it's just important to think and remember that neuroplasticity isn't always a good thing. And it's way too simplified to assume that psychedelics increase neuroplasticity and that's how it works in improving mental health.
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, neuroplasticity is just a state where change can happen.
Yeah, and that can be good or bad. So I think, the context of neuroplasticity is also one of those other kind of myths that you read about in like healthcare magazines or journalists, and there's just assumption that it's a good thing.
But it's also why set and setting is so important, because you're in such a plastic state in the psychedelic experience, and you're so sensitive to it. That's the last thing I have to say on plasticity.
So we spoke a little bit about psilocybin, the research that's been going on over the last decade, and then we've also talked about these non-psychedelic analogues. But there is also this kind of third way, and that's short-acting psychedelics, which is a favourite of our panellists here today. And that's DMT. So DMT is a short-acting psychedelic, and I don't know who wants to kick off. So maybe Chris. Chris has actually pioneered a lot of the research really into DMT, the effects of DMT in the brain, doing the first kind of modern-day brain, multimodal brain imaging scans as well. So Chris, if you can kind of give us all a bit of an introduction to your work with DMT, that'd be great.
Yeah, so for those of you who are not very aware, DMT stands for N,N-dimethyltryptamine. It's a naturally occurring psychedelic drug that can be found in many plants, and it can even be found, according to some research, in the human body at very minuscule amount. DMT is also part of the ayahuasca brew, which I guess many of you know about or are familiar with at an intimate level. And it can also be smoked. And when it's taken in ayahuasca and it hits hard, or when people smoke it, it's kind of unusual among psychedelics because it generates this immersive experience in which the ordinary world that we usually experience goes away and instead is replaced by this, what is usually described as alternate dimensions, sometimes inhabited by sentient presences or beings. So we were really interested in this kind of experience and what it can tell us about the mind and how it relates to the brain, right? Because in a way, if you think about it, what DMT is doing is somehow deconstructing the usual way in which we perceive and understand reality, and instead we construct a novel world of experience. So this is under this notion or this idea that really the brain is not really this just passive organ that is receiving, information from the external environment, but it's actually actively always developing these worlds of experience that we call everyday reality. Well, we perturb the system with DMT. And we've done several experiments with trying to understand what's happening in the brain where people are having these immersive experiences, doing fMRI and EEG research, where we found essentially that this kind of like this mechanism of construction has to do with the hyper-engagement of our imaginative capacities that we have in the human brains, this engagement of the human-specific functions that allows us to construct story, imagine these worlds that we inhabit, and therefore might be overactive or modulated in a significant fashion when we're having these DMT experiences. And very lately, my PhD student, Lisa Luan, she led the first extended DMT infusion study where we extend that DMT state. So if you just give this DMT, you inject it with a short-acting bolus, you will get a 5-minute trip, intense trip. What we're doing here is that we're extending that for at least 30 minutes, which opens up exciting possibilities in consciousness research in terms of exploring these worlds of experience a bit better and understanding them a bit better, but also possibly in clinical research, right? And the possibility that we can somehow, tailor a specific psychedelic experience according to the needs of an individual. Some people might need a strong short-acting experience. Other people might need a smooth entrance into that state, and others, different kind of possibilities. So, yeah.
I'm another DMT researcher. You literally can't move for them in London at the moment. And I completely, how do I say this? I share Chris's fascination, and I think what I understand of his, as his reasons for his fascination in DMT as a tool for understanding the relationship between mind and brain, and he said it much better than I could. So I suppose what I can do is describe a little bit about our research at UCL. So we're running a fairly large study. Half of our participants will be healthy volunteers, and that's really more about understanding just the brain effects, I suppose. The way the study is going to work is we will have people come in and watch a feature-length movie in the scanner. They'll go home and come back in a week later, receive DMT in the same scanner, go home again, and then come back and watch another movie. And the reason for this is because of, well, I suppose what Chris was mentioning in terms of, what is it about our brain that enables our capacity for us to, well, how did you put it? For hyper engagement of our imagination were the words that you used, right? How do we construct these scenes and these stories, these fully immersive stories that we find ourselves in a DMT state, that our participants find themselves in? And I suppose in our group, this is really rooted in our belief that this is rooted in changes to language processing in the brain. So this is why we really want to get a snapshot of the brain while it's doing language processing in the most natural way possible, which is watching a movie. This also invites the really fun possibility of training a neural network on the images that people are seeing in a movie to decode those scenes that they're seeing in the movie just from their brain neural activity and applying it to the DMT data afterwards, so we can start decoding hallucinations. So I really want to see that. I don't know if you can call that science. I think that's more engineering, art. I'm not really sure. The other side of the study is much more Bex's, and this is looking at subclinical populations of hazardous drinkers and how it can be used to manipulate their memories into drinking less. So I'll let Bex talk about that.
Yeah, so we're using a subclinical population of drinkers. It just makes it easier to use. If we were doing a full clinical trial with alcohol use disorder, it'd be a lot more paperwork, to be honest. So we're using a subclinical population. So we can look at the brain mechanisms and the changes before and after DMT and during it to see if there's any predictors of any predictors of the neural correlates that mediate these clinical benefits. So our supervisor Ravi, he's invented this quite like brain hacky paradigm to interfere with memories associated with drinking. So when you see a beer, you have this, if you like beer at least, you have these like reward memories that are associated with it, then that makes you want to grab the drink and drink it. And so we show drinkers pictures of beer or whatever their favorite drink is, and give them a beer, and then we blast them with DMT, and hopefully they stop drinking after it. That's the hypothesis and aim, pretty much in a nutshell. But yeah, I think it's there's not been really much research done with DMT, looking at its clinical sort of potential based on the neural correlates. There's been clinical research done with DMT, like there's a company called Small Pharma, and they've recently completed a successful phase 2 trial with treatment-resistant depression, showing that DMT is beneficial for treating depression. I don't know how it compares to psilocybin, but with similar efficacy. And that opens a really sort of interesting debate of like, do you need the full 4 to 6 hour length of a psilocybin experience to have that clinical benefit, or can you just go in your lunch break, get a 20-minute hit of DMT and be fine,
Don't they call it the businessman's trick?
Exactly. So it's a really interesting, and that also that gives us so many more questions of like, do you need this insight into your personal life and your problems that you might gain in the length of the psilocybin trip to sort of have that benefit, or is it just the neuroplasticity, or is it like, what is it that's actually
yeah
yeah
and I guess the the key kind of question is about scalability. So we're now entering a phase where, we are entering the final stages of research with psilocybin, so what we call phase 3 clinical trials. And they're predicted to finish in about 2025, 2026, and potential rollout in 2027 is what currently people think. And if you think about the lack of resources we currently have in the NHS and mental health services, and the burden of mental disorders, which are growing exponentially every year, then we really are faced with the problem of how we're going to be able to deliver these treatments in, a system that isn't constructive to delivering it. So having 2 clinicians maybe and a treatment room for 6 hours is a lot of money. It does cost a lot of money. It takes a lot of time and training. But perhaps with a drug like DMT, and Chris said that, from the research he's done, you can change the timings. So maybe a 30-minute trip might be beneficial. But you can imagine you can get more patients in a clinical room per day if you do DMT therapy than you do with psilocybin therapy. And that's also why LSD therapy, which is 12 hours, we don't really see that much of that, because clinically it may be just a bit too long if we can still get the same effect. So that's an open question, I think, that's still going to be explored. Yeah.
So I also would really love to know something from Maria about the kind of trends in DMT use at the moment. I know a lot of people are using it not in clinical settings at all. I think obviously the vast majority of people are using it not in clinical settings, and I'd really how are people using it? Where do we get it from? How can I find some? No.
You can cook it in your kitchen with basically a huge variety of plants that go on the street corner if you have some basic chemistry kit. But I can't say in public exactly how.
But what can you tell us about the DMT research you found in the public?
Well, so I think I'm in minority here as not being a DMT-focused researcher. You really can't move around in London without them. I'm an all drugs researcher with a particular focus on psychedelics, because those are the ones that I find the most fascinating out of them all, and potentially the most promising for so many different things to do with human nature. One of the things that I would say with DMT is that it's actually not the most common choice of drug that people make. I guess it might be considered a businessman's trip, but what I find is that there's not so many business people trying to do a very quick DMT, and especially not repeatedly try to use DMT. The people who engage with this drug are quite rare, and the ones who engage with it a lot are even rarer than those who just decide to try it out. And I guess this is where we need to think about what actually happens during the experience itself. And my colleagues were talking about how it's shorter acting, and potentially this means that more patients could go into the clinic on a daily and have it, and then you get to treat more people. But I would say even if the experience is shorter, the intensity of it is quite high. So I suppose maybe that also speaks to how well tolerated psychologically, physiologically it might be. There's quite a lot of contraindications, as I would say, exist with DMT, and a lot of personal fears, not mine, but like the individuals who might want to take it recreationally, for example, because it's that kind of substance that often requires a sitter to be around, a very comfortable environment, because the person completely loses the sense that they're in a room where they were before. They get transported to a completely different reality. And in that reality, since they don't even see what is around them in the same way anymore, they might meet aliens, they might meet various entities, they might be in space. That poses quite high risks. I suppose a lot of people are aware of this, and that's why we don't see it being consumed as often. So, yeah.
We will come to questions in, what time is it? In 10 minutes. It's fascinating. Drug use outside the lab versus in the lab. As we mentioned, psychedelics are very context dependent, and sometimes they're not the best models. I think, there are massive limitations with some of the research and the applicability, and we call it ecological validity. But there's an exciting new advancement in psychedelic policy, which actually happened last month. And that was in Australia. So in Australia, they changed the law such that psychiatrists are able to prescribe psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression, and also MDMA, which I haven't spoken a lot about, today, for PTSD. And that is before the phase 3 clinical trial data has come out. But this is an excellent opportunity for researchers to be able to collect what we call real-world evidence. So that is evidence of this drug being used by clinicians and doctors in the natural environment. So in the context of these clinical trials, we give very specific dosing. The patients that come to the studies have very, very unique and not necessarily relatable conditions to the general population. So they might have depression, but it might be unipolar depression. And we actually know that most people with depression have multiple morbidities or comorbidities. They may have anxiety, they may have a co-occurring substance use disorder. And mental health, as Maria mentioned before, is very complex. And so it's going to be fascinating over the next few years. And Drug Science, a charity that I work for, that has excellent information about actually the science of drugs, which is free of kind of any moral kind of agenda, is going to be collecting that data alongside a charity in Australia, and we're going to really try to get the nuance of what the right amount of redosing is, what the right dose is per patient, and see whether there are any kind of effects that we haven't picked up in the lab. So we're very excited about that, and there's other advancements in the US as well. So in Oregon and Colorado, there's legislative changes now happening, so not patients, but individuals who want to go and take those compounds for wellness or for kind of well-being related issues can now do that legally. And I think in the next decade, a lot of people are calling this the psychedelic roaring 20s. And we are seeing that in terms of the boom in scientific research, medical research, the advancements of psychedelics in policy. I mean, even Westminster, there's a group called PAR, Psilocybin Access Rights. I really urge you to go down to their tent, which is just that way, and sign a letter to your MP, because conversations are now really happening with the Home Office, in Parliament, related to rescheduling. So we're really living through an era where psychedelic medicine is no longer a fringe science anymore. And I truly believe it's going to become more mainstream. I think we've covered a lot over the last 50 minutes or so. And we've got a roving mic somewhere, I think. Or if we don't, then if you could, yeah. So if anyone has any questions, put your hand up. Start the gentleman at the front, and I'll make sure everyone gets a chance to speak. Yep.
Yeah, thank you, guys. That was really interesting. Yeah, I understand the issues with scalability around, the longer trips, let's say DMT with an MAOI like ayahuasca or MDMA, and I see the benefits of DMT or 5-MeO DMT being very, efficient for the NHS and stuff. But I'm just wondering whether, with a longer trip, whether there's a bit more space to understand what's going on, and to kind of have a form of integration ready within the trip, within the experience, and make clinical benefits be higher. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to, I think that intuition is very much correct in the sense that, again, if we take the experience to be an important mediator of clinical outcomes, then it would make sense that a longer experience would, or a sufficiently long experience would allow for these, life-changing insights to occur. Now, the contrary sort of argument to that would be, well, the intensity of 5-MeO DMT, in which you experience maybe your own death in such a massive way that you learn to let go of all these different things, could also provide that sort of benefit. And I think that there's emerging intuitions around that the intensity of it might also carry some forms of psychological risks, especially with 5-MeO-DMT, which induces such a strong experience that if the individual is not really ready for that, or doesn't have a strong cultural and relational container for that, that although there might be some form of, short-term relief of certain symptoms and, aspects of depression, it can also lead to additional forms of issues, especially with 5-MeO-DMT. And, I don't want to put it in so pathological terms, but, inklings of delusional thinking or troubling what they call reactivation sometimes, where people just re-experience the 5-MeO-DMT experiences, and all general challenges of integration. So I think even if it's short-acting, the intensity of that experience also carries with it some degree of cost. And I don't know if, we have developed those containers to hold these kind of like very massive experiences.
As intense as 5, I appreciate that. But could that not be similar for DMT, for just this straight up?
I think it's less. And this definitely what we've seen. So you don't have, for example, reactivations with DMT. With DMT, it's also the matter of dosage is key. While you do see, potentially, similar things happening in ayahuasca groups, people who have like DMT-like experiences which are longer, I do feel that we have a cultural, DMT is not such a new drug. And in the West, we have developed stories and narratives that hold these experiences a bit more when you compare it with something like 5-MeO-DMT, for which we have almost no cultural prior context. And I think that this is the key difference.
So I just wanted to add to that a little bit, because I feel I have conflicting opinions about it, really. I think just on it's a kind of a rational sense, like what is it about any experience that can change our behavior? I mean, there has to be a memory component in this, right? And it doesn't really matter whether or not the memory's formed over a very short period or a very long period. It's when you're in a particular circumstance that makes you behave one way or another, and you're referencing a memory to make that decision. And I think in that sense, I don't think it matters. But there was also one of the big papers that came out this year was this, I'm going to get the title wrong, but it's Psychedelics Reopen the Social Reward Critical Period of Plasticity, right? And these researchers found that actually, like, the time of occupancy at the 5-HT2A receptor, so basically like how long the drug binds for, correlated with how long this critical period was open for afterwards. So in terms of, how maybe in terms of the negative effects, just how much a memory can stick with you from something scary that you've seen, then yeah, I think probably both LSD occurring over 12 hours and DMT occurring over 15 minutes can probably have those effects. But in terms of the therapeutic effects, I think, maybe occupancy is actually at the receptor binding is quite a big deal. The duration of the trip is quite a big deal, I think. So I don't know what to conclude from that, really.
Well, we see it with ketamine. So ketamine is now like it's off-labelly prescribed for depression, as well as addiction and some of the psychiatric conditions. And you see patients actually having to go back quite often, up to 12 infusions on average is the amount of retreatment that they need. And actually with psilocybin, we don't think we need that much. But yeah, the ketamine experience is a lot shorter. We don't really know the differences, but I think, we're still trying to figure out what the appropriate dosing schedule is. And a lot of the kind of ways that we're going to find out that is through big data sets and developing personalized and predictive algorithms. Like, you're going to be very different to the person next to you in terms of your clinical response. And that's going to be a combination of maybe your brain archetype, your personality type, your clinical history. And we just really don't know enough yet. And that will only come with, more research. And we always say as scientists, more research is needed. But really, we do in order to actually deliver the most effective treatment to patients so that they don't spend years trying to find out and waiting, that's been the problem with psychiatry over the last 70 years. Patients don't see doctors for ages, they get prescribed the wrong meds. It's about 3-4 years down the line until they actually find something that might work a little bit, but by that time their pathology is so ingrained that it may have exacerbated it. And we don't want to make those same mistakes with the emergent psychedelic, psychiatric sort of delivery. And so, with the tools that we've all described today, we're probably going to edge a bit closer, but I think it would be wrong for us to say we really know what the appropriate therapeutic delivery is yet.
Just wanted to comment on the ketamine. So it's been seen in clinical trials that ketamine is very effective for treating depression, but the efficacy doesn't last as long as with psilocybin. So with psilocybin, it's thought to last around 3 to 6 months. It's been shown to be effective for treating depression, but with ketamine, it's about 2 weeks. Debatable, but yeah. So that raises interesting questions of, why does psilocybin, create this longer-lasting efficacy than ketamine when they have quite similar modes of action when you look down at the cellular level, like what it's doing to neuroplasticity and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's something we really need to look at.
Yeah. Another question. You pick.
Hi. You mentioned set and setting earlier on, but most of the discussion seems to have been about the clinic. And I'm wondering how important you think that is, considering that in a lot of informal use, people would go on a retreat, they would spend a lot of time in the preparation, they would have their experience, and then a lot of integration afterwards. And how important do you see the preparation and the integration to the outcomes of their experience in the clinic?
I can take that. Set and setting is the most important feature of any trip, in clinic, outside of the clinic. Being comfortable with the people around is one of the most important things. Being in an environment where you feel safe, where you are just comfortable to experience what's yet to come in the psychedelic trip. I guess that's one of the reasons why I think the psychedelic treatments work in clinic, the supportive set and setting that is paired with the drug itself that puts the person in this neuroplastic state. For a lot of these individuals, as I've mentioned, they were treatment resistant, nothing really worked for them, and a lot of them may not have had that level of support during such an intimate kind of experience before. So it's really the combination between this very, very supportive environment and the drug itself. It's very important. But obviously the work doesn't stop there. It matters how the person enters the trip, like what sort of mindset they built around it before. There's quite a lot of discussion at the moment in the scientific community about this expectancy, and especially due to the hype that we've seen in media, whether it's just the fact that people expect the trip to work, whether that plays any role in the outcomes afterwards. But very often, and in most cases, people need prolonged periods of times afterwards where they keep revisiting what they've experienced, talking things through. That's what integration is. And I think that's really, really important, to be integrated in a sort of medicalized model that's being formalized in many ways at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, and just sort of on that, there are communities now that have come out. So one of them is called PsyPAN, so that's Psychedelics Participant Advisory Network. And that came from two individuals that took part in Imperial and King's College trials. And they've developed this community for patients that have gone through clinical trials. And the aim is to kind of harness this, it's kind of demedicalized, I guess, community-based care and practice, quite similar to what you see with AA or NA. And it's about patients being given the autonomy to take their, aftercare into their own hands. And it's actually a new form, a new way of delivering community-based mental health care. And it's a new concept. And I think personally it is going to work because we have to have some form of decentralization and more community-based input if mental health systems are to work. Because right now, as we mentioned, there is a chronic overburden. And actually taking that autonomy in your own recovery might actually be beneficial, and actually being a shepherd and passing on that message to other participants in the aftermath and the integration is maybe healing in some way for some people. So yeah, I think it'll be really interesting. So if you're interested in looking at them, they're called Saipan, a very good charity. They give a lot of talks about their own experience, and I think that kind of model may be what things might look like in the future. Any other questions? Is this gentleman here?
Hey guys, it's really an honor to be able to hear all of this great information about psilocybin and about transformation that has existed from these substances. And I'm here today actually because of this. 12 years ago I had a journey which saved my life, I will say. Maria, I had attended over in Derby your presentation that you had done about a 2-hour thing about psilocybin and about classical psychedelics. And then that was a wonderful experience to be able to just bring some of my friends out and then
Thank you.
to be able to have an understanding of kind of the possibility or the potential around these treatments. And I just wanted to only convey some thinking that you had, Chris, like about, well, what is the, kind of a general thing that we've been discussing, I think. What is the nature of the duration of the 5-HT2A receptor, if that is being, that's obviously a very significant component from my experience. I will say empirically that's what I've experienced as being like a major transformative effect. And a parallel that I like to draw, perhaps, as you described, well, the risks of 5-MeO-DMT, and then the risks that there could be like some resurgence and some other after effects from that. Well, we can parallel that maybe like to things like electricity. Like you can get a lot more energy if you up the voltage. Maybe that's 5-MeO-DMT, Or consider it like with cooking. You want to cook something, you want it to be just beautifully done. If you if you sear the living hell out of that thing, it's going to end up some crispy, and it's not really done like you want it to be, really. But if you do give it a slow cook, it takes more time, right? But maybe it's psilocybin with a 5-hour, maybe some LSD with a longer time, has that possibility to have a more lasting and a safer neurological effect. So we can get some parallels, like watering a garden. You can deluge, and you can get the water onto the plants, but then the plants might get washed away or something. But meanwhile, if you just give a nice slow trickle over time, as nature does with rain, that's a nice, like, natural way to be. And that's what psilocybin has done. Like, Kalindi went off on the deep trips, maybe, but yeah, that's like slow trickle, and I just wanted to draw that parallel and see what you might have thinking about that, perhaps.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. That was beautiful. Really appreciate that. And I think continuing with your analogy of the plants, for me, this is a way of cultivating the mind. Like, if we think about, like, not just people who have a psychiatric condition and get better out of the psychedelic treatment, but maybe people who don't necessarily have a psychiatric condition and use psychedelics as an existential practice. I think in both cases, what we're talking about is a form of cultivation, and that requires time, care, and attention from not necessarily just one individual, but possibly many individuals. And I think it's in this idea of cultivation that we can understand better this as a form of really a practice that involves set and setting, the preparation before, the integration after, the tools that the person has to come into this cultivation of the garden, the information that they have, and so on. And I think that this is the key sort of component in this, is that, in the way that we usually think about psychiatric treatment as you just take this drug, you just take that and you have this passive sort of role. I think what this form of treatment really stresses is, again, this idea of cultivation, having this active component, this engagement that has, in my opinion, always an existential quality, and therefore requires that degree of care, attention, and possibly time.
It's almost like it becomes a way of living. Yeah.
I'd say with regards to the duration of these things as well, I think maybe with slightly lower dose psilocybin or LSD, there's this kind of exquisite sensitivity that you get to your surroundings that I think is actually probably always there. Where someone can flick a light switch and everything can change, or put a particular song on and that can completely change you from A to B. And I think really, like, that is the state that we live in a lot of the time, but just don't necessarily consciously realize that. And to have I don't know. I think getting more time in this state, not in like hyperspace in DMT state, but to kind of practice having a sensitivity to your environment is great. I'm into it.
Just on that, actually, we're doing a trial with patients with OCD at the moment, and we're giving them a 10 milligram dose, which is like, a less than half of the full dose. The motivation for that was actually because patients with OCD have these kind of repetitive behaviors, which are kind of more behaviorally ingrained, rather than perhaps emotionally ingrained, which we see in cases like depression. So there might not be as much of a limbic component to that. And so we think maybe actually by recalibrating sort of more the cognitive cyclical processes involved in OCD can actually be remediated by having a 10 milligram dose. And actually OCD is about control, and a lot of the patients were like, we don't want to lose complete control. That would even scare us, maybe make us feel more unsafe. And so actually having a 10 milligram dose might be just enough to kind of refrag the thoughts and the thinking processes without going, full mass to entity world or whatever else, the full doses. So different doses for different conditions, for different people, I think is, definitely something we need to think about. Thank you.
So much. I appreciate it.
You too, thank you. The lady in the back, middle, back.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about the contraindications with SSRIs and psilocybin. I know that there's a big one with ayahuasca and DMT because of serotonin syndrome. Just like to understand a little bit more about that. And then with psilocybin, I think you mentioned someone who's had SSRIs for a long time, that the psilocybin can actually be numbed a little bit because the same receptors are being used. I guess there's a few questions there. The main one is there a contraindication besides the fact that the psilocybin doesn't work as strongly with someone who's currently taking SSRIs, and someone that it could still be beneficial to someone while they're on the medication, side by side?
Yeah, I mean, I can comment a little bit on this from some of the work that we've done. So actually, the largest trial, one of the biggest studies that have been done in it was done by a pharma company, and they found that actually maintaining on SSRIs doesn't seem to change the clinical effect. But what we found in our study was when you taper, as in take people off the medication, that reduces the effect even if they have the same level of mystical experience in the trip. And so it might be this kind of withdrawal-like syndrome that occurs from tapering the SSRI away that may reduce the clinical output. So now the question is about maybe people can just stay on SSRIs because it would be more beneficial, perhaps, rather than putting them into a withdrawal state. Perhaps also afterwards, SSRIs can be included. And I think it's quite important personally to say, based on clinical data, SSRIs do work for people, and they are shown to be effective in reducing depression. And they have helped save many lives. And I don't think it's important to, as a scientist, to sit here and negate the fact that that has been a very credible and effective medical intervention, and it's not perfect. And we're not saying it's perfect, and psychedelics do offer perhaps an alternative and a different approach, but SSRIs are medicines that do work and have saved a lot of lives for people. So I do want to stress that. But yeah, in terms of contraindications and other medications, there's some research about lithium, for example, and actually that changing the seizure threshold. So people on lithium that take psychedelics, there's been some case reports that shows that it can develop into seizures. So you have to be careful. I think there's a lot more pharmacological data coming out on, drug interactions that we're going to see over time. I don't know whether...
Can I comment on that as well? So from the experience of people who are on SSRIs and try to take psychedelics, the majority of them that I've ever seen, and I've seen a substantial number of people in this situation, they don't actually experience the psychedelic effects while being under SSRIs. They only come about after they start lowering the amount of SSRIs, when they start to get off them and so forth. But one of the risks that I found with these people is that they might not feel anything after an hour and a half after taking the dose, and then they try to up the dose up until they start feeling something. And I think this is where some of the potential risks might come in, because we don't really know what happens at a very high dose of a psychedelic from someone who just tries to get something and being on the backlog of the SSRIs for weeks, months, or depending on their personal history. Also, not all SSRIs are the same. There are slight variations that might need some more looking into. And so far, there is some very limited evidence to suggest that, a normal dose of a psychedelic one-off on the top of an SSRI might not be problematic, but there's no data looking at upping that dose and in the long term what might happen. I think this is something that we really need to look into.
Yeah, we do know that psilocybin is very physiologically safe. So you need around 70 kilograms of magic mushrooms to have any lethal toxic dose. So I don't think we've got issues with going too high. You might become unconscious and not process it. Yeah, in a healthy individual, but you need to take a lot of magic mushrooms to have any toxicity. So physiologically, very safe.
Just briefly, just on another sort of known interaction is if you're taking any MAOI, so monoamine oxidase inhibitors, that will stop most psychedelic drugs from breaking down, so you'll have a much stronger experience. I've heard people describe it as vegetable television before, so maybe avoid that or don't, I guess.
Sorry, what does the vegetable TV mean?
It means it's a much stronger experience. So people have described psilocybin plus an MAOI as vegetable television because they had, I think it was with reference to their own trip. Nothing grounded in any firm reality, I think.
Yeah, in the middle.
I was intrigued by a phrase you used earlier that I've heard quite a lot, and I'd like to unpack it and ask what each of you might mean by this. You used the word moral agenda, as though we should avoid it. Avoiding moral agenda. What does that mean when... are you not motivated in your research by like the good life, what is good? What are your motive, like, because I understand there was a political backlash in the 60s that was motivated by a moralizing, but what do you mean by moral agenda?
Yeah, so I think I said that. So
we all have a moral agenda, right? We all have a moral agenda. So what's your moral agenda? Yeah.
For sure. So yeah, really, really interesting question. And that comes into kind of the role of scientists, the role of politicians, the role of public speakers, like this talk, what we're doing right now, what does that actually really mean and boil down to? And the moralization of drugs comes from this kind of, patriarchal view that states of consciousness to some degree can be controlled by the state. That was something that was imposed by Nixon's government in the 70s. And we believe, and anthropologists and political commentators believe, that was initiated through a fear of individuals that were taking psychedelics that might be against the foreign policy agendas of the US at the time in relation to the Vietnam War and other kinds of, political kind of warfare that the US were involved in. And the drugs were perhaps banned because individuals were becoming pacifists at the time. And so it didn't assimilate well with the establishment or the patriarchy's idea of what they wanted. And so drugs became demonized and they got put in a class of people that take drugs are bad, drugs are inherently evil. In fact, it actually started before that. It started in the 30s with marijuana. So marijuana before that time was cannabis. And cannabis got named marijuana to give it a Latin-sounding name, a Latin American-sounding name, to stigmatize the Latin American folk that were living in the US at the time. And there was these news articles called Reefer Madness, basically insinuating Latin American communities to be behind a lot of crime and hatred, when actually it was alcohol that was driving most of the bloody crime. And we know that as a fact. Like, alcohol drives the most crime. But after Prohibition and in the 20s, they needed a new evil to kind of make the DEA a redundant task force in jobs. So this moralization of drugs has happened throughout history. Now, as a scientist, I don't think we can have a moral agenda. We have to be led really by evidence and data. That's my personal taking. There's things that are good and. I mean, philosophically, it could be taken as a moral stance that we decide that evidence is the thing that we go behind, and I do see that point of view. But instead of me kind of asserting, so what politicians do is they use evidence and then make an opinion based on a totality of evidence. What we like to do as researchers is put evidence forward and debate amongst scientists. But, I mean, I do understand your point, but maybe we do stand too much behind the evidence is a guard for us.
Can I entertain Mark's question for a moment? Just because I really like the question, actually. I think the moralization, everyone has their own opinions. Obviously, as scientists, as Ryan mentioned, we cannot really use our opinions to drive our work because that's not what we're supposed to do. However, I think that generally speaking, when looking around, like I tend to see a new sort of moral norm in the world. And that's not to do with the fact that drugs are universally bad or we should ban all drugs and so forth. It's more to do with the fact that perhaps the only reasonable reason why someone might want to use a drug is to treat a condition, which I think that goes against a lot of things that I believe about human nature and the human right of being in charge of your own consciousness and being able to choose what you do with your own state of being, who you are and who you want to be in the future and so forth. I think that is the real moral problem that we might be facing as a society at the moment. Who is allowed to use drugs and for what reason? I don't think that should be up to anyone but the individual to decide for themselves, based on enough evidence being around so they can make informed decisions, of course.
I think it's an intriguing question because I think what you're hinting at is that sometimes science takes this disembodied point of view in which it's almost like this inert, supreme way of, knowing the world. And I don't think that's the case. I think we all have a moral agenda. We all have our implicit biases. And that I think, science is flawed. At least many elements of the way science is practiced is many times flawed. I do think that science is inherently a method in which those biases can become more clearly visibilized because of the peer review system, because of the way that knowledge can be created. Of course, there's influences it's not really a disembodied place. It's very much an embodied, incarnated place. I just feel that, in a way, it is a way to approaching the way that we understand the world that I think can enable us to advance with, a certain good degree of awareness, which I think is a blind spot many times from other institutions. And I think that has value.
It's something that I struggle with, I think. I really struggle with it because what I like to think motivates me is just like an aesthetic thing, completely. There's something, truth or not, there's something beautiful about being able to tell a really satisfying story about something so interesting. But I think that's also quite a naive perspective to take because these stories that you tell, I mean, once the cat's out of the bag, they're used for purposes that you didn't necessarily intend. And I think there's maybe a slight irony in how a lot of the science that's done on psychedelics is being used at the moment. I mean, it's being leveraged for massive corporate gain, which is fine, which is okay, and maybe that's going to help a bunch of people. Personally, I struggle with wanting to come and do talks, wanting to get out there because I don't necessarily want to help those guys, but here we are, I suppose. I don't know what to do about it, and I'd love to hear some suggestions, to be honest.
Isn't the medicalization of the human condition, birth and death itself essentially a moral statement to some extent, saying that you need to be in a certain place to be born, or to die, or to find God.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a problem. We shouldn't have it.
I mean, yeah, the last thing I want to see is, I feel like a lot of psychiatric treatment, well, a lot of the DSM-5 at least, a lot of how we put people in different categories based on constellations of symptoms is about, well, the treatments for them are kind of about repairing productivity in a sense. You know, this really isn't my wheelhouse, you know, like, I really shouldn't be speaking about this so much.
Like they use psychedelics for heterosexualization therapy, right? Because
Wow. What?
Yeah, Stan Grof actually. Believe it or not, it's in his book.
homosexuality was considered a pathology of DSM. So again, that's a moral statement, and it's hiding under the guise of this falsifiable positivism, but actually it's not. It's an opinion.
I guess with psychedelics, a lot of people can feel like them being such a powerful tool, they should be controlled in one way or another. This is what we've seen with the prohibition before, and in ways or another that might emerge at the moment. And again, I'm mentioning what I think I'm seeing, which is this push for, if it's within a medicalized model, it's okay. If not, it's dangerous, and there's not much information at the moment for that. But I'm optimistic that we are all going to be kind of focusing on the individuals, providing harm reduction resources, providing education to the masses, and eventually accept psychedelics as being something that any individual might just want to partake in. Because it's just, you know, one of the multitude of avenues of exploring consciousness that we have in society. Just like we allow people to do paragliding and bungee jumping and so forth.
They're such an interesting toy, aren't they? I mean, some
Yeah.
people want to study them, some people want to sell them, some people want to take them to enhance productivity, some people want to meet God. I mean,
Would you recommend jumping out of a plane to anyone? No, but you would allow some individuals who have read about it and like did a bit of training to explore something that's varying degrees of danger depending where you do it, who with, and so forth. But you wouldn't completely prohibit it. You would give all of the guidelines to ensure safety. Why wouldn't we give psychedelics a space in society in the same way?
Yeah, I completely agree. But I do think that by sort of looking at psychedelics through this medical model has allowed us to do this research after 40 years of nothing, because the system that we live in, unfortunately, is this capitalist bullshit. And it is the only way that this was, you know, the imaging study in 2012 at Imperial that showed that there was this reduction in default mode network activity. That facilitated more research because it allowed us to get a grant to do this. And the government do not want to give us money. Imperial were just awarded the second grant that's been given to psychedelic research since the 60s. The first one was the MRC grant, which was for the treatment-resistant depression trial, and the second one, Rayyan was awarded with the Imperial team, David Nutt and David Arizzo, for the gambling addiction trial that will be upcoming soon. So it's so hard to fund this research, and if we just kind of like try and shove it into the medical model, it allows us to do that. But obviously, like we, you know, I think a lot of us in this field...
I completely agree with you on this, and it's the reason why the research was allowed to start to begin with, putting it through this framework. But I think it's about the honesty that we have going forwards into that's not the only way.
100%.
Of course, but there is a multi-tiered system that can evolve out of this. It doesn't have to be one or the other, because medical diagnoses do exist, and if we work in psychiatry, and there are people that really need medical help, okay, that is a fact. Mental health covers everyone. In fact, most people, 70% of people in any given year experience symptoms of anxiety and depression, but they don't have a diagnosis. And to get a diagnosis, and working closely with psychiatrists for the last 4 or 5 years, you see the difference between somebody who's struggling, which we all do and all have done, versus somebody who's genuinely treatment-resistant depression or, you know, severely addicted. Those individuals need a medical system, and they need some kind of oversight from somebody who has clinical expertise, and that model works for them. But there are a lot of people that don't fit into that model. In fact, most of the population don't have a psychiatric disorder. Most people experience times when they do need a little bit of help outside that model, and what's going on in the wellness space is absolutely important. and is evolving, and it's happening in Oregon and Colorado, the Netherlands, and it will probably happen here at some point too. And I think we do need to start looking into that at the same time, and not just choose one. I don't think it's
absolutely not choose one or the other. It's like coexistence of a variety of ways that might work for different people.
Absolutely.
And you don't. And you don't need to have depression or addiction problems for psychedelics to improve your well-being and your quality of life. And it's a shame that the system doesn't recognize psychedelics as having that potential. It has to be this unless you're pathologically depressed, that you can have access to.
Just to briefly mention that there's a lot of applications and research in psychedelics within science which are not about the medical model.
Yeah,
exactly.
There is plenty of evidence. Like right now, Leo Roseman is going to speak about his work in communities with Israelis and Palestinians drinking together, which is completely not related to the medical model. I do think that the equivalence of what's happening with psychedelics right now and medicalization is a mistake. It's not the full story by any means. It propels a lot of the funding, but a lot of the funding does not come exclusively from that. And I agree we need to start opening up, more public funding for other sort of potential applications. And I think it's actually inspiring in the way the fact that psychedelics can open up those avenues to visibilize how community can have a massive impact in well-being thought in a very general way, not as a medical issue or even from positive psychology, but just from the idea of living a good life, which also has a moral agenda, but not necessarily the same one that
some people might
is
not
corresponding to medicalization.
Just want to say, some people might not be interested in well-being at all. Some might just want to meet the aliens or see the fractals. So that's also valid.
You can also have fun with psychedelics. It doesn't have to be always
fun
so
shouldn't
serious.
be, not allowed.
We do have to wrap up now, unfortunately, but we will be around here. So if you want to come grab us for a quick chat or whatever. So just to finish, if you're interested in anything we have said today, there's a website, a charity I mentioned, called Drug Science, which has lots of information on the latest research related to drugs. We cover all the kind of bits, blogs, podcasts, newsletters, events that happen in London and other places around the country. You can follow the Unity Project on Twitter, Centre for Psychedelic Research on Twitter, all these plugs. So
one more plug, actually. The UCL Society for the Application of Psychedelics is going to be back up and running in September and hosting some talks as soon as I book them in. So come to one of them.
Thank
or
you.
speak.